Okay, it looks like we're recording now. So this class is about how to write your data management plan, which is going to be required by almost any grant funder that you will apply for funds from these days. Both public and private funders are requiring data management plans. So we're going to go through the different parts of the data management plan and talk about what kind of information that they're looking for, and I'll give you some examples of some data management plans as well. So starting out, what is a data management plan? And you'll hear me just call it DMP for short. It just makes it easier. A DMP is a document that explains the what, why, how, who, when, and where for managing, sharing, and preserving research data. So there's a lot of different parts to a data management plan. It's not a very long document, however. It's most of the time can only be 2 pages when you're submitting it with a grant proposal. So you have to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of space. So you kind of have to be selective and brief and very brief about how you describe things. But they do have a lot of information that they want you to cover. The data management plans mimics this data lifecycle, and this is a data lifecycle that was prepared by a Data One called the Data One project, which is an NSF-funded project. We have actually a lot of people here at UT that work on Data One, but it's an international organization, and they developed this data lifecycle to kind of help researchers think through the different processes that data goes through on a typical research project. It's an idealized life cycle that it's obviously not going to be the same on every project. It's not going to go through the same these same steps in this order on every project, and sometimes you may not even have a specific step. One of these steps you may skip a step, but the point of it is really just to show you so the different phases throughout a life cycle of a project, and to think through what happens with data during those phases. So, if you think through the data life cycle and what you're going to be doing with the data through this data life cycle, then that's really what your data management plan should describe. So, in other words, you're going to describe how you're going to collect the data, how you're going to make sure that it's high quality data and clean, and how you're going to describe it, analyze it, preserve it, etc. So we'll go through these a little bit more in detail later on. So who requires data management plans? A lot of funders require them these days, and so we'll go through them one by one. Just you'll probably see your favorite grant funding foundation or grant funder or foundation here. The NSF, of course, is going to be your main one, and all of the subdirectorates of the NSF are going to require data management plans. National Endowment for the Humanities, if you're in the humanities, specifically the Digital Humanities Office will require a data management plan. National Institutes of Health. It's slightly different for the NIH than it is for the others. The National Institutes of Health requires a data sharing plan, which is a little bit less. It's a little less extensive than a data management plan, and it focuses mainly on just sharing research data, how you're going to share the data, as opposed to how you're going to manage it throughout their life cycle. But at this point, the NIH just requires a data sharing plan, and it's only for grants that are $500,000 and greater. But in the future, we don't know exactly yet, but hopefully in the near future, they will start requiring data management plans, which will be very similar to the NSF's data management plan. USGS is also another one if you get funding from there. The Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and specifically the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, they require a data management plan. So does NASA and NOAA. And then some other smaller ones that you might not you might not use as often: the Gulf of Mexico Research Institute, Institute of Education Sciences, Joint Fire Science Program, Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is the grant agency that I would use if I were looking for grant money as a librarian, National Institute of Justice, and then your private funders like the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. At this time, I'm not aware that the Gates Foundation requires a data management plan, but they may. And if they don't now, they probably will in the future. So if you don't see your grant agency that you typically use in your line of work, then it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have one or don't have a requirement for a DMP, but I'll show you a tool that you can use to check and see who has a data management plan requirement and what those requirements are a little bit later. So let me just get into now what a data management plan should include, and just kind of the top level headings you should include. Believe it or not, your data management plan should talk about the data that you're going to talk about, or you're going to be collecting in your research project. A lot of times I see data management plans that talk a lot about the publications that are going to result from your data, articles, presentations, conference, things like that. That's not what your data management plan needs to talk about. It needs to talk about the data themselves, not how the data will be disseminated through articles and publications, just the data itself. You'll talk some more about the people that will be involved in the project, all the way from the PI down to your grad students or undergrads that you have working with you, and even staff that are not necessarily students or project staff that are maybe support people. You'll just kind of briefly talk about what those people do and what they're responsible for. And we're going to go through each of these groups in a little bit more detail a little bit later, but I just want to hit the high level at this point. You're going to want to talk about the metadata, which is data about the data and information about how the data were collected and things like that. Security, in other words, if you have data that needs to be protected in some way, you're going to talk about how that data will be protected and kept secure. You're going to talk about how they're going to be shared and how they will be accessed by other people. And then also about how they would be reused. And then lastly, how do you plan to preserve the data? So I'm going to pause for a moment right there and see if there are any chats. I don't see anything entered in the chat, so I'll assume there are no questions unless somebody wants to go ahead and ask a question at this point. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and move on, and we'll stop periodically again in a little bit later. So moving on to the data. Your data management plan is going to talk, all the different parts that are going to be from the standpoint of the data. So at first, you're just going to talk about the data itself and what you're going to collect. In other words, what kinds of data are you going to collect in your research project? And when I talk about kinds, and when I say kinds, what I mean is it going to be mostly numerical data? Is it going to be mostly textual data? Is it going to be digital photography? Is it going to be videos or audio, things like that? And it can be multiple types or kinds of data. You just have to talk about what they are and mention what they are. How much data are you going to be collecting? And you may have at this, early on, and when you're writing a data management plan, you might not have any idea how much data you're going to collect, or in terms of gigabytes or megabytes or terabytes, but give an educated guess. It doesn't have to be exact, of course. This is just kind of give the NSF or your grant funder an idea of how much you're going to be collecting. And what file types do you anticipate collecting as part of your research? Is it going to be mostly Excel files? Is it going to be specialized file types that come out of some specialized instrumentation that you're going to use, or specialized software? Just mention what the file types are, and then how much of each of those you're going to collect. And if you have some ideas about how those data files will be organized, then briefly discuss your organizational scheme. And this talks about things like, your folder structure, your file naming conventions. If you have any thing that you're intending to use as far as that organization goes, then you're going to have to do it briefly because you won't have much space, but you might want to get into that a little bit. But this is, if you haven't really thought through file organization or file naming, this is a good place to think through that and kind of figure out how you're going to manage all that. So that's the first main part of your data management plan. So I'm going to just show you an example of one that came from an actual DMP. And so you'll see here some of the different parts that I mentioned a while ago. The data generated will be raw CO2 measurements, meteorological data, calibration and reference standards. So that talks about the different kinds of data they will be collecting. And then it says, well, they will be placed in comma-separated values in plain ASCII format, which are readable over the long term. So the CSV is your file type that they would be collecting data in. And they mention which are readable over the long periods, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later, and that's preservation. When you're preserving a digital data file, it's best to put them in an open and preservation-friendly file format so that they can be readable over the long term, because file formats become obsolete relatively quickly over the course of, 10 or 15 years. A file format could be obsolete. So if you intend to want to be able to maintain access to that data file over the long term, you want to put it in a file format that is preservation-friendly. So this comma-separated values is often used for numerical data. And then, let's see, it says here, the final data product distributed to most users will occupy less than 500 kilobytes, which will be distributed on request, comprise less than 10 megabytes. So this talks about how much of the data they anticipate collecting. So there's not going to be a whole lot of big data collected on this project. It's going to be a lot of small files. But so just think about how much of that data, and you'll just talk about it in that first section regarding data. If there are any questions about the data portion before I move to the next portion, please let me know. I do have one more example about the data portion that I'll show you here. This one is geared towards social science data, whereas the one previous was more of the hard sciences data. So this one talks about the different types of data that they will be collecting would be textual data and digital photographs and video recordings. And so those are the different types they'll be collecting. And then it goes into more detail also on the different types of textual data. And there'll be field notes and anonymized text transcriptions. And then the digital and video recordings of public work activities. So that talks about the different types. One thing it does not get into, though, it should have probably gotten into how much of these different types of data they plan to collect, and in what file types they would collect them in as well. So if there are no questions about the data, I will move on to the next part. And please remember, if you think of a question, just enter it in the chat box, and I will get to it as soon as I can. The next section will get into the different people that are involved on your research project. And so start out by talking about who will be involved in the project. And you can be specific and name names, or you can be more generalized and just say the PI or the postdoc or grad student, things like that. Many data management plans I see and review do spell out people's names, and that's fine. And because their names are probably spelled out all throughout your proposal, so doing the same in the DMP is fine as well. So when you talk about who's going to be involved, you will also talk about what their roles are going to be, and that goes along with the next line here, what they're responsible for. So talk about the PI's role and their responsibility, which of course in the PI's role is ultimately responsible for the data and the implementation of the data management plan. But the PI often delegates that to other people. You may have a PhD or a student or a postdoc that you want to assign responsibility for making sure that certain parts of the data management plan get implemented on a regular basis. And then you may have you may have undergraduate students you might put in make responsible for regular data backups or regular data cleanup or things like that. So you'll talk about that in this part of the data management plan. And then your funder also wants to make sure that you have thought through a transition plan. If someone leaves the project, how will you make sure that those responsibilities that person had would be transferred seamlessly to the next person, so things don't fall through the cracks? Especially important things like making sure your data are regularly backed up and archived. If you have someone that's responsible for that, then make sure you have a good transition plan for someone to take that over. This is an example of the roles and responsibilities section, the people section of the data management plan. This one talks about there's 4 principal areas. Management of the data management plan would be one person's role, or of course, people can have multiple roles, but training other investigators and non-project staff in data collection, that's another role. Short-term storage and backup of the data, that's going to be another person's role. And then dissemination of data during and immediately following the data collection period. I always laugh at this one because every time I give this class, I show this example. It says there are 4 principal areas of responsibility, and then it gives 5. So, so the long-term storage is another role that may or may not be the same person who's responsible for short-term storage and backup. So, just consider that. And so this one actually talks about the PI's names and co-PI's names and what they'll be responsible for, and then what their plans are for long-term custodianship. That last paragraph, and they do plan to transfer data to the National Anthropological Archives, etc. And so these are different roles and responsibilities. And what I would have probably recommended had I reviewed this data management plan was that they would specify more, get more specific about who is responsible for each of these parts. It says the PI and co-PI is responsible for a lot of this stuff, but they could also have nominated other people and broken those up into other people within the project as well. So that's the portion that talk about the people that are involved on the research project. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll move on to the next major part of your data management plan, and that's going to talk about metadata. And this image is a a funny just way of saying that metadata is really to help you and other people understand the research data. And um, and I know from my own experiences, when you don't have good metadata that describes the project, um, when you come back to a research project in the future, and it doesn't take very long before you start forgetting details, then if you come back to it and say a year or two, it's hard to remember what happened. So that's why metadata is so important. The first question you want to think about is, how will you describe your data? And there's different metadata standards that you can use, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But whatever discipline you're in, you might have a standard metadata standard that you are used to using, or that people within your discipline are used to using and understanding, and so you want to think about that. And you also want to think about how you will describe the project, so not specifically just the data themselves, but your overall project. So it can be as broad as describing the purpose of the project, and it gets even more specific to things like when the data were collected, like what time period, where the data were collected, and that can be as specific as bounding geographic coordinates. It can also just be things like Knox County, Tennessee, etc. And then it gets down even more specific to the data, and you describe the data themselves and how those data were collected. What do different units and measurements mean, and how they were collected. And then I mentioned metadata standards, and you may have one that you like to use, but there is a very general one that I often recommend for people that that just need to describe research data in a generalized sense, and that's called Dublin Core. And Dublin Core, I can send out a link to you that would show how Dublin Core is supposed to be built. It's a very standard, very generalized metadata standard that gets into things like title and author and description and date and things like that just kind of describe how the data were collected. But then, like I said, you may have one that's very specific to your discipline. So, for example, in the geographic and geological sciences, there's a geographic metadata standard called the Content Standard for Digital Geographic Metadata, and it's very specific. And everybody within those disciplines is usually familiar with this discipline-specific standard. In ecology, there's another one called Ecological Metadata Language, and there's in the biological sciences, there's one that's very specific called Darwin Core, which gets into things like the genus and species and kingdom and all the phylos, all these different parts of the organisms' names and things like that. So it just depends on what discipline you're in as to what metadata standard you might want to use. But like I said earlier, if you don't have one that you know of, or you're not going to use this discipline specific, then Dublin Core is a good, very generalized metadata standard. And like I said, I will send out a Dublin Core metadata record example to you at the end of the class. If I can't get it and put the link in the chat, I'll send a link out to you all via email. Are there any questions about metadata? Here's some examples from DMPs that talked about the metadata. And the first example is from, this one is from geographic sciences, maybe geography or geology, but it uses a metadata standard called ISO 19115, which I know is a geographic metadata standard. And so it just describes, we're going to be using this ISO standard to describe the research data in this project. Um, and then it talks about which format that metadata will be in, and they're saying they're going to use the XML format for that metadata standard, which makes it machine readable, and that way you can import this metadata into other systems that can read it. And then the second example is from social sciences, and it says here the data will be described using a metadata format called DDI, which is short for Data Documentation Initiative, and that's a metadata standard that's specific for social science research data. And it's also going to be made in an XML file format, so it's machine readable. So those are just two examples of how you might address the metadata issue in your DMP. Now we're going to get into data security, and some questions that you want to answer in this section of your DMP is: how will you protect privacy and confidentiality if your research data includes human subjects data or other issues that might maintain privacy and confidentiality? What is your plan for making sure that happens? And so, and also if you have to get IRB approval for your data, you talk about that here as well. And what is your plan for backing up the research data? And you want to answer two questions specifically. Where do you plan to back up your data, and how often do you plan to back it up? Now, backup is one of the most frequent questions I get is how do I back up my data, or where, and what is your recommendation for backing up? So the recommendations I usually give is to make 3 main copies of your research data. And the first main copy will be the one that you're going to be actively using on a day-to-day basis, and that can be saved on your local hard drive, on your lab computer, on your desktop computer, whatever it is where you're actively doing your research. And then on a regular basis, and however regular that is will be dependent on how often you're creating data, but on a regular basis you want to create another copy and a local external copy. So the first one will be a local internal, so that'll be on your lab or your laptop at your desk, and then a local external copy. And what I mean by that is one that you can maintain in your possession but is external to your computer. So that would be an external hard drive, and that's really my main recommendation for that copy. I don't recommend USB sticks. I don't recommend CDs or DVDs because they're so easy to lose, they're easy to break, and I can't tell you how many times I've sent a USB stick through the washing machine because I forgot to take it out of my pocket. And so you want to make sure that you don't lose your data in that way. So an external hard drive is really the best, most stable place to do that. Now, it is, I understand it's easy sometimes to lose an external hard drive, that's something that may get stolen, but that's just one of the 3 copies. So, but that's the most stable of external copies. And then the third place that I would recommend you use is an external copy that's not local to where you are geographically. So, and the best place I recommend to put that third copy is in UT's OneDrive account. And as a UT affiliated staff or faculty, you have essentially unlimited storage in UT's OneDrive. There is an upper limit somewhere, but if you reach it, you can always request more. So I would recommend you use UT's OneDrive, and the reason I'm recommending OneDrive is as opposed to other, like UT has a Google Drive account as well, but OneDrive is HIPAA compliant, it's FERPA compliant, and it's the most secure basically of all the options that we have available to us here at UT. And I certainly don't recommend you using your personal Google Drive or your personal Dropbox and those kinds of things, because you don't have UT's backing if you lose it. So you want to make sure that you use UT's OneDrive. So those are your 3 copies. Um, Local internal, which can be your hard drive on your computer. Local external, which is an external hard drive. And then external and not local, which is, I recommend UT's OneDrive. And so how often you do that will, like I say, um, it will depend on how often you're creating data. If you're collecting it all day long every day, you want to make sure your backup plan happens probably multiple times a day. Because if you lose one day, you may have lost a lot of data. But if you're only collecting data once a week, then your backup plan can only happen once a week, and that would be sufficient. And then the last thing you want to make sure you cover, if it's not covered in the previous part about people, is who's going to be responsible for making sure that this backup plan happens on that regular basis. Now let me see, I think a question popped up, and so let me pause for a moment and look at that. How much of social science data is typically shared publicly? And what do we need to do to talk about how those files will be shared among those involved in the research? And what backup storage requirements do people typically include? Okay, so the first thing is how much social science data is typically shared publicly. So a lot of social science data is shared publicly, but the main thing you want to be aware of is social science data often includes human sensitive data or human identifiable data. So you want to make sure that before that data is shared publicly, that the data is anonymized. And there's a lot of different identifiers that you want to make sure that your data does not include. HIPAA is a good resource for making sure that that your data does not contain human identifiable information. And there's a HIPAA list, which I can share with you as well. It's a list of, I can't remember, 16 or 19 and different identifiers that you would want to make sure that your data does not include. So if it does include it, you would strip that out before you make it publicly available. Another thing you want to make sure of is if you're collecting human subjects data, you're going to have to get IRB approval. And in your IRB approval process, you want to make sure that the IRB is aware that you will be sharing your research data and that they're aware of how you will anonymize that data. And then third thing is you're going to also have to get consent from your participants when you collect data from them. So you'll have them sign an informed consent form, and you want to make sure that your informed consent document also spells out that the data will be made publicly available after it is anonymized. So there's a lot of issues that you want to make sure that you cover, but it is possible to share social science data, and in fact, it happens quite frequently. Let's see. How do we need to talk about how the files are shared among those involved in the research? You can talk about. Well, let's see. Files shared among research participants, people that are involved in the research. Was probably the best way to do that is via your OneDrive account. That way, everybody involved in the research can have access to it, and it is password protected on your OneDrive account. And if you're dealing with people that like collaborators that are at other institutions, then you can share that data with them as well through OneDrive, and you'll have to get a OneDrive account for them set up. But OIT can do that for research colleagues that you're collaborating with at other institutions. So everyone will have access to the OneDrive, and that's really your best bet for collaborating and sharing things back and forth through the course of the project when you're actively collecting data. And then what backup storage requirements do people typically include? Well, one of the reasons that I recommend you use OneDrive is because it is encrypted on both sides. It's also encrypted when data is sent back and forth. So that's one that's one main reason why we want to use OneDrive. And also, you'll mention that your OneDrive account is password protected, and it's always behind that login for your UT NetID and password. So um, that's one thing. Another thing you would probably want to mention in that data management plan, that OneDrive is encrypted at rest, it's encrypted en route, it's encrypted on the back end too, so that everybody is understands that the data is safe. All right, so I'm going to move on to the next section if there are no more questions. All right, access, sharing, and reuse. So you're going to want to address how you plan to provide access to the research data. And this is not access to other people within your research group. This is access to the public, essentially. So, they want to make sure that the research data is shared publicly, and then how do you plan to provide that public access? There could be, you may decide to use a discipline-specific data repository and put the data there. Once the research project is finished, you may choose to use UT's data repository, which is called Trace. I'll get into that a little bit later when I talk about preservation. You may decide you want to just make a project website and put your data there. I don't necessarily recommend that, because it's not always the best option as far as security. And if you want data to be accessible without your involvement, then you may not want to put it on a project website that requires you to kind of mediate access. Will there be any limitations on access to it? And limitations are acceptable if you can describe in detail and provide that good reason why you need to limit access. So maybe there's data that you cannot anonymize for whatever reason, without making the data completely useless. Well, of course you would want to make a limit on access to that data, and many data repositories can put limitations on access of specific files, and so you would want to make sure that is described here. So for example, you've got a data file with some sensitive information that there's no real feasible way to strip it out, then you just say the data will be made available under certain specific requirements, and that maybe one of those requirements is that the participant, or that someone who wants to reuse the data has to fill out a confidentiality agreement and things like that. So you just talk about that here. And then last, who would be interested in reusing that data? This is kind of what I describe as the broader impacts. You talk about broader impacts of your research and your proposal, and this is where you want to just kind of briefly say what other researchers or other disciplines even might be interested in reusing the data you collect on this project. And then let's see, that's all for access, sharing, and reuse. So if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. And I'll move on now to the preservation section, and this is the last section of the DMP that I will discuss. And you have different options for preservation. I mentioned discipline-specific repositories before. If you have a data repository that is widely used within your discipline, then that may be your best bet as far as keeping your data preserved and making it publicly available, because people within your discipline know it, and they're familiar with it, and that's likely where they'll go to look for data if that's if they're looking for data to reuse. If you don't have an idea of one, or you don't have another option, UT's institutional repository, which is called Trace, is a good option as well. And if you decide to archive and preserve data within Trace, then you would just contact me, and we'll walk you through that process. Any questions about preservation? Okay. Um, at this point, oh, here's an example, I'm sorry, of, I forgot I had this example of preservation. So this talks about how data will be preserved. This particular DMP was about uh, it was a social science related project, and they said that they would archive the data at the Odum Institute at UNC Chapel Hill. And the Odum Institute is a social science data archive, and so they just said that's where they're planning to preserve the data, and so that would satisfy the preservation component of that DMP. So you could say whatever your discipline repository is here. You can also mention trace as your preservation plan. Okay. So now the one thing I want to show you is an online tool that we have available to you to create data management plans, and that's called the DMP tool. And let me see if I can quickly pop out into, let's see, stop share. Just bear with me one moment while I get this set up, and then I'll see if I can share this screen. Okay. Can everybody, excuse me, can everybody see the data management planning tool? I will assume that that is an affirmative. This is a tool that we provide to you. It's free for you to use, and it is available at dmptool.org. This tool was created by California Digital Library and some other institutions, and it's a really handy tool. But so you'll access it dmptool.org, and then up in the top right, you'll see the login button. You'll click that login link, and the first thing you need to do is choose University of Tennessee from this drop-down list. And as you scroll down, you'll see dozens and dozens of other universities who are also using this DMP tool. So we're in a group of a lot of universities who use this tool and provide access to it. So you choose University of Tennessee. Click Next. And this is going to bring you to your normal NetID login. So just do that here. And you log in. And it's going to bring you to your dashboard. And my dashboard may look slightly different from yours because I'm the admin for the DMP tool here at UT, but you'll see a lot of the same stuff. So you'll get a dashboard, and what you want to do to create a new DMP is click this Create New DMP button. And I don't recommend you use anything on that right column where it says Copy an existing DMP. You want to start with a DMP template, which is on your left column here. And so you click the Select Template button. And here you see the long list of grant funders that have DMP requirements, and all of those grant funders requirements are built into this DMP tool here. So you would just select the one that you're going to be applying to. We'll just pick we'll click National Science Foundation. And just for example purposes, I will click the generic DMP template, and then you will click Next, which is on your bottom right of your screen there. And here's where you enter some some basic information about the data management plan. So we're going to call this, just for purposes of today, NSF generic example. You can input the solicitation number if you want, and the submission deadline. Those are optional. The only other thing that is required is for you to select the visibility. If you select public, that means anybody who goes to this DMP tool will have access to your plan, and that may be okay with you, but it may not be. So institutional means only people at UT will have access to your plan to look at it. They can't change it, of course, so they can just look at it. Private would just mean everybody is cannot see it except for you. And then test or practice, and that's what I'm going to choose now. This is just for you to kind of play with the DMP tool and figure out what it does if that's what you intend to do. Now you can also add co-owners. If you have collaborators with other people at UT or other institutions, you would add their email addresses here. And they can all access it, and you can all edit and create plans in conjunction with one another. So once you've filled out the required components here, you click on Save and Next. And this is where you get into creating your DMP. You'll see on this left side here a template outline, and these are the main components of the DMP that you will be addressing. And you'll see that they closely mimic the types of the areas that I talked about in the presentation just prior to now. And so you'll talk about types of data, metadata standards, policies for access and sharing, etc. So what this is going to ask you to do is just to read the guidance that's provided for you here, and then address it in the box below. You actually, still have to type it in and think it through, but it gives you the guidance of what that funder wants in this part of the data management plan. So just to move through this process on this plan on the tool, I'm going to just enter a number here so I can save and go to the next screen. The next screen will talk about data and metadata standards, and you'll see the guidance box up here. You can make it full so you can read everything, and then you would address what it's asking for in the box below. So I'm just going to put a 2. Let's say that as you're reading this guidance, you have a question, you don't know what it means by something. You need some additional help. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can click on the links button or the links tab above, and it gives you some general resources about National Science Foundation data management plans. It also gives you some links to UT resources. This data management guide is one that I've created. UT's research data policy is another one that you might want to read if you haven't already. And then just some other specific guidance from UT. And see, this particular part of the DMP talks about data and metadata standards. So I've given you some links here that talk about that in my data management guide. So you can also, up top, you'll see my contact information up here. If you want to contact me directly, you just click on that link and it will send an email to me, or you can type out an email to me. So we're going to move on to the next section. This section talks about policies for access and sharing. Again, your guidance is up here. And there's also links here for if you want to look up specific guidance about that. Just going to put a number 3 there so I can move on. As you notice, I'm putting numbers. It's going to require you to put something in the box. You can't just skip it and move to the next one without putting something into the box. So that's why I'm having to put numbers. So this section is about policies for reuse and redistribution of the data. And then the last section is about plans for archiving and preservation. So that's the last section. So you click Save and Next when you get to the end, and it's going to give you a preview of your data management plan that you've created. You have some options to export this as a PDF. There's a button for export as PDF. There's an export as Word doc, and then you can also print it directly from the DMP tool if you choose. Unfortunately, at this time, the DMP tool is not set up to feed your DMP directly into your grant submission system, which here at UT we use a system called Cayuse. So you're just going to have to export it as a PDF or a Word document, and then you'll attach it with your grant proposal when you submit it in that system. Now, one thing I wanted to point out to you, though, is at the end of your DMP creation process here, you'll see a button at the bottom that says Request Feedback. And this is a handy tool for you. If you click on Request Feedback, what it's going to do is send an email to me, since I'm the admin, and it will say that a plan has been submitted for feedback, and then I can go into my tool here and into my dashboard and review your data management plan and make comments on it. And if there's some things I think you can make stronger, or something that I recommend you change, I'll make that comment in here. I just want to make sure that you've covered everything that they require, and also want to make sure that you're not promising too much that you may not want to bother with later. So that's a handy tool that I recommend everybody use, that request feedback. All right, so let's see. That is it for the DMP tool, and if you have any questions about it specifically, please put that in the chat. I want to move back over now to the PowerPoint because there's two or three last slides that I want to just cover briefly. Let's see here. Okay. So there's a class coming up in a few weeks. I believe it's 3 weeks from today. That's about data management best practices I wanted to bring to your attention. So this is a follow-up to today's class. So let's say you've created your data management plan, you've submitted your grant proposal with the DMP, and you are successful in being awarded the grant. So congratulations, now you have to do the work. So this is a data management best practices class, which is more of the nuts and bolts of managing data on a day-to-day basis. So this gets into file naming and organization, talk about file versioning, some pros and cons of databases versus spreadsheets. We'll get into more about metadata, talk more about backup and security of your research data, and some other things. So this class will also be online on Zoom, and that's on October 26th at 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. So I encourage you to sign up for that one if you are interested in learning more about the nuts and bolts of data management. And tell all your colleagues to join up as well on October 26th. And then the last thing I wanted to tell you about is we have a group of librarians here in Hodges Library called the Scholars Collaborative, and we have some specialized people here that can help you with different parts of your work. If you're interested in learning more about copyright and issues related to your publications, then you would want to talk to Rachel Caldwell, who is our scholarly communication librarian. She can help you work through any issues related to copyright. And then, of course, I'm your data curation librarian. We have Eric Arnold, who is a geographic information system specialist. So if you have any need for GIS related or mapping related issues on your research, Eric is your guy. And then Michelle Brandon is our media literacy librarian. And so she can help if you have a research project or even a class project where you want students to do any video recording or audio recording or editing or graphics type work. She can help you with that because we have a really great area in our library called the Studio, which has a lot of really cool tools for audio, video, and editing and graphics, things like that. So, so that's our Scholars Collaborative, and I would we'd love to see you. If you have any questions, you can always email us at scholarsco@UTK, and we can address your questions or set up an appointment with you if you need a consultation. So that is it for today's class on data management plans. I hope you found it useful, and if you have any additional questions, you can put them back in the chat here, or you can email me directly at caker@utk.edu. Let me put some information here in the chat. My contact information is caker@utk.edu. And then if you want to, let's see, let me end this sharing. If you want to register for the class that's upcoming in a few weeks that I mentioned to you on data management best practices, let me give you the link where you can do that. And this is on the Office of Research's website. Where's the chat there? Okay, there's the link to sign up for the data management best practices class. All right, well, if you have no more questions, then that's it, and I'll end the presentation, and later on today I'll send you some additional links, something about the Dublin Core metadata standard, something about the HIPAA requirements for anonymizing research data. Also, we'll send you information on where you can find the recording of today's class. And let's see, one last question: would it be possible to obtain a copy of the PowerPoint? Absolutely. I'll include the PowerPoint slides as well in the email that I'll send everyone later today. All right. Thank you all for attending, and I will go ahead and end the class.